Josh Fenton, CEO. Want to give a quick update. If you haven't seen a profile on Troy Simpson, he's a classical high school grad. He's getting his master's in finance down at Vanderbilt, and he's also a key player in one of the coolest bands that's breaking out. Take a look at that profile in the video. And sadly, overnight, there was yet another shooting in Providence, this endless streak that's been going on for the past year and a half. Clearly one of the most violent times in the history of Providence. Take a look at that update. But let's go down to the University of Virginia. The chair of the political science department, Jennifer Lawless, we're lucky to get her. She was on MSNBC all this week talking, previewing the election and then in analysis of it. So let's, Madam Chair, what happened to the Democrats on Tuesday?
It was not a good day. It was not a good night. You know, I think this was an example of what can happen when voters have expectations for a party and its candidates and they fail to deliver. And ultimately, Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate in Virginia, lost despite the fact that Biden won Virginia just a year ago by more than 10 points. And Phil Murphy barely eked out a win in New Jersey, despite the fact that Biden won New Jersey by 16 points. And so, you know, this is an example of national tides affecting local races and the Democrats' inability to deliver on what the voters were hoping for.
Yeah, it's got to be Democrats across the board, whether progressives or conservatives, need to be pulling their hair out about how these self-inflicted wounds are taking place and how much they've reinvented. The Democrats have reinvented the Republican Party. Let's go to Donald Trump. My takeaway is he's a big loser in this. You know, he got Heisman'd in Virginia. He was not really in the narrative in New Jersey very much. And Youngkin's victory kind of shows to other Republicans, you can win this thing. Just go back to sort of Republican, middle of the road, fundamentals, keep Trump out of it, and you can start winning some certainly purple states.
So I'm not sure, that's not the lesson that I would take from it for several reasons. The first is that although Youngkin didn't campaign with Donald Trump was still a pretty steady presence in terms of getting out the Republican vote in Virginia. Indeed, Virginia voter turnout among Republicans was very, very high. Part of this was he did these teletown halls. Part of it was targeted voting and, you know, sort of online and virtual events to get the Republicans out. There were also rallies where he would call in. Youngkin didn't participate, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't count on Donald Trump's supporters to turn out. Donald Trump also made a really, really big plea to ensure that voters in Virginia who are Republicans or Republican-leaning get to the polls. The other thing I would say that's a little bit different about Glenn Youngkin from other Republican candidates that are going to be running for Congress next cycle is that he didn't rely on anybody else's money. He's very, very wealthy, and he could fund his own campaign, which means that Donald Trump and his donors were less relevant. The other thing is he didn't have to get through a Republican primary. Virginia has this weird thing where there's a convention and party insiders anoint the Republican nominee. And so he didn't have to run as far to the right as he might have. But the final thing I would note is, although his rhetoric was kinder and gentler than Donald Trump's, his policy positions are just as harsh. So it's not the case that he's a moderate Republican. He might have been able to frame himself a little bit more as one than some of these other candidates will have to be.
Terry McAuliffe's closing argument in the last few days was attacking Youngkin for the vests he wore. I mean, it was sort of crazy talk. Like, I'm going down. I'm going to throw every possible thing against the wall, and hopefully something will stick. Terry McAuliffe, I've never thought to be a great candidate. I know he'd won the governorship previously, but is that part of it? He was just a tired old politico?
No, and let me tell you why. If you look at the way the other Democrats fared who were running for statewide office, Terry McAuliffe only did a tiny bit worse than they did. And so he received about 10,000 fewer votes than the Lieutenant Democratic governor candidate received. He received about 15,000 fewer than Mark Herring, who was running for re-election as Attorney General. But those are sort of on the margins. All of these candidates who were not Terry McAuliffe and who ran campaigns independent from Terry McAuliffe, although obviously there was a coordinated campaign, but you know, they were candidates who didn't necessarily suffer specifically from his gaffes or from some of his attacks. They fared just as poorly. And it trickled down too. If you look at the House of Delegates, it looks like the Democrats are going to lose control. Best case scenario is that if this one final race that hasn't been called yet, maybe you've got a tie. But so that suggests that it's not just about Terry McAuliffe. And also, Terry McAuliffe didn't campaign for Phil Murphy in New Jersey, and Phil Murphy barely won there as well. So, I don't think that this is a situation where if Terry McAuliffe wouldn't have suggested that Glenn Youngkin was Donald Trump in a fleece vest, he all of a sudden would have won this race.
Phil Murphy up in New Jersey had a run on his record of family leave, highest minimum wage in the country, a whole series of the same ideals that are now packaged in much of the congressional package that's still in debate. And he was expected, I know you thought he was 8 to 10 point winner the week before. He was expected to win this thing fairly easily. Fabulously wealthy, former top person at Goldman Sachs, worth billions of dollars. And as of Wednesday morning, he was down by 800 votes at one point, pulled it out as late votes came in from some of the more urban areas and edged it out, but really just by fractions.
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing here is that independents, basically, because Democrats voted for McAuliffe and Murphy at the same rates that they voted for Joe Biden, and turnout wasn't lower among Democrats either. So this wasn't a sense of the party, the core party establishment migrating away from these Democrats. It's about independents. And in both of these cases, you had a swing where independents were supporting Biden, and now they swung back in the other direction, in part because they voted for Biden and they saw unified Democratic control in Washington and assumed that that was going to mean delivering something and making true to the promises that Biden made. And they don't have anything yet. And not only isn't there an infrastructure bill, not only hasn't the Build Back Better Act been passed, but all we hear about is how the sausage is being made and the communication about what's actually in these bills and how it's going to affect New Jersey voters, how it's going to affect Virginians' lives, has sort of been left out of the calculus. So it's a communication problem. It's definitely a legislating problem. Voters are impatient. They don't understand the legislative process, and it looks worse to them than it is. And it already is bad when you've got Democrats going on television, Joe Manchin in particular, 18 hours before the polls open, saying, yeah, we no longer have a deal.
Okay, so let's go to, let's quote Harry Truman, the buck stops here. Joe Biden's the president of the United States, is the titular head of the Democratic Party. Democrats control both chambers, they control the White House, and other than one remaining January coronavirus piece of legislation, Democrats are 0 for 2021. What's Biden got to do? He's either got to call Manchin out, which I think will be very difficult because of the way Manchin functions in West Virginia, or he's got to call the progressives out. He's got to do something to break this logjam. It's not getting any better. Than the verbiage is only getting more toxic.
Yeah, I mean, today Joe Manchin said that he couldn't support the $1.7 trillion Build Back Better Act. At the same time, Nancy Pelosi has put back into the bill paid family leave, which had been a compromised position when it had been removed. The progressives and the moderates are sort of stuck. It looks like they've got their ducks in a row in the House and can pass this bill, but there's a lack of trust when it comes to what's going on in the Senate. So Joe Biden, his only chance of not sort of overseeing crazy, crazy losses in 2022 is to pass both of these things and to do it fast. He's got to go to the Capitol, and he has to stop giving choices. He has to stop saying, well, whatever you guys want to put in the bill is fine, or I'm going to leave it to you, or I just want to help generate the framework. You can work out the details. It's clear that they can't work out the details. And so if he has the ability to negotiate the way that he claims that he does, the way that many Democrats believe that he does, the rubber has now met the road. Like, it's time to do this. And whether it's fair to ask a president to be involved in the nuts and bolts of all of this, whether it's typical, it doesn't matter. If he wants to stave off major, major losses in 2022, he has no choice. And he also has to make Joe Manchin's life a little bit more difficult. At this point, there have been no consequences whatsoever. And Manchin has reneged. You know, he's not playing this game as a fully trustworthy player. He's reneged on multiple occasions. And he's got to see that that means something. And, you know, the other thing Manchin should be worried about, too, is that, not only will he become completely incidental if the Republicans win big next time around, but there's no question that the Democrats are going to do everything they possibly can to win Pat Toomey's seat in Pennsylvania, to win Rob Portman's seat in Ohio. And if they're somehow able to hold on, they're going to make Joe Manchin's life a living hell as well.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Manchin always has the ability to switch to be a Republican and hold on to his Senate seat and throw the dynamics up in the air yet again. But let me ask you a question from a leadership standpoint. And Joe Biden has been so deferential. He goes up to Capitol Hill. I don't remember too many presidents going up to Capitol Hill to negotiate with members of their own party. These people should be summoned to the White House, and Joe Biden needs to put this stuff on them. Listen, we don't hold the House and the Senate. It's on you, leaders. Get it together. I mean, this isn't a case. This isn't a case of split chambers.
This isn't rocket science. He's said it. Nancy Pelosi has said it. Chuck Schumer has just said it. I've said it. You've said it. We've all said it. I think this is no longer a situation where one day Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema are going to wake up and be like, "Oh, I didn't realize." Okay, right? Like you've got to play you've got to play hardball at this point, and he's got to figure out a way to get them on.
Okay, let's go to a slightly different issue, but tied to both the election results, the problems in passing anything, but also some of these second-tier races. Did the Democrats just go too far left? And let's talk about some examples. Minneapolis, the effort to transform the police department, quote, into a public safety department. This lost even after body camera video came out in the last 30 days of police officers saying really horrible things in the night of violence after George Floyd's death. The average person in middle America, even in a liberal city like Minneapolis, is not ready to get rid of the police.
I agree with that, and I don't think that most Democrats want to get rid of the police either. If there's one thing that the Democrats have learned, and frankly, most Democratic candidates hated the defund the police messaging to begin with. That wasn't something that was thought up by political consultants that were working with Democrats. That was an activist cry. That's not where the American people are, but it's also not where most Democrats are. So some of this has to do with messaging and the manner in which you can convey that something is not what it seems. My sense is that overall, I don't think that the Democrats have moved too far to the left. I don't think that they've misread the mood of the country. I think they're having a bad time and a very difficult time communicating in an effective way what it is that they stand for. Because if you look at the policies that they support, if you look at the components of the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Act, they actually have majority approval on their side and a healthy chunk of Republicans. The problem is that they're not conveying this, and they have about 10 minutes to figure out how to change their communication strategy.
Okay, let's go to a couple other examples. Buffalo, New York, in the Democratic primary, a socialist candidate defeats the incumbent mayor, an African-American male. He comes back. He's slightly more conservative, but Buffalo's a conservative city. Upstate New York is conservative blue-collar, might be Democrats, but it's blue-collar Democrats. He comes back, beats her in a write-in, almost 2-1. Does that tell you that the Democratic primary voter is far to the left?
Oh, no question. So the Democratic primary voters are very, very far to the left. The Republican primary voters are very, very far to the right. And in part, this is why we have a problem in this country, because the activists and the extreme candidates are the ones who wind up running in general elections. And then you have the rest of the American people having to decide between two candidates. They generally choose the candidate who shares their party identification, but probably not a whole host of their preferences. So until we can figure out a way to, sort of encourage average voters to vote in primaries at much higher rates, these dynamics are going to continue. And then you wind up getting heightened polarization in our political institutions because the people who win are way more polarized than the average Democrat and Republican in the population.
Okay, let's bring this all to Rhode Island. We've got a 5-way Democratic primary for governor. 4 of the candidates have won statewide in the past. The newbie coming into this is a woman who's a top-level corporate executive and all the baggage that brings with it. but she's worth $100 million. She can both raise money and self-finance. What does all this mean to the Democratic gubernatorial primary in 2022 in Rhode Island?
I think there are two big lessons that were learned. The first is if you're going to run on Democrats are competent and we know how to govern, you need to be able to point to national Democrats being competent and being able to govern. Because the reality is that when people are looking at statewide races, they're still doing it through this national lens. There might be specific issues to a given state. There might be things that people in Rhode Island care about in particular. But at the end of the day, when they think about, well, what have the Democrats given me lately? They're going to be thinking about what Joe Biden and Joe Manchin have given them lately. So it's very, very important for Democrats running to make sure that they're also advocating for national policies that are going to work for Rhode Island. The other thing that I would say is that, you know, the Supreme Court is going to be deciding two very important cases between now and the Rhode Island election. There's an abortion case and there's going to be a gun rights case. And it's very, very likely that, at least with the abortion case, you know, there's going to be a chipping away at Roe versus Wade that might even lead to a complete overturn. And that means that the states have complete control, and it means that the governor ultimately can either sign legislation to secure a woman's right to choose or, you know, sign legislation to chip away at it. Now, these Democratic candidates are all pro-choice, but it's going to be very, very important for activists and for the Rhode Island population to get a sense of how strong and how much they're willing to advocate.
Here in Rhode Island, generally, primary voters are, as you stated, just like other states, more activists, more left-leaning, etc. Does it set up a situation where a Helena Folks, who's a corporate executive, or even a Dan McKee, the sitting governor, who's for the most part a little bit down the middle or maybe even a little right of center in the Democratic Party right now, are they wildly exposed? And does a candidate who I think many Rhode Islanders would not be in favor of, but in a Democratic primary, the hard progressive stances of a Matt Brown, does he have the chance to win in a five-way primary?
So I don't think Matt Brown has the chance to win in a five-way primary. There are too many. He's been part of the political scene, and he's had sort of negative coverage and been linked to scandal and corruption for well over a decade now. I think it's very, very hard for him. He'll chip away at some of the vote, which actually makes it easier for all of the other candidates to win. But, you know, I think what the candidates are going to have to decide to do is whether they're going to try and position themselves as being the most progressive, or whether they're going to all sort of stake out little different pieces of territory and then try to drive up voter turnout among that territory as much as they can. So is one candidate going to portray herself or himself as the most progressive on social policy issues and then do everything possible to make sure that social policy voters turn out? Is somebody else going to run as the I can strengthen the economy candidate and make sure that anybody that cares about that issue turns out at unprecedented rates? So there are different strategies that, you know, can be in play. I just don't think that it makes much sense for all of them to run as far to the left as they possibly can.
Okay, so let's return back to Washington. Give us your assessment of what Joe Biden needs to do and what that timeline is to be able to have any chance of saving control over either chamber in the midterm elections.
I mean, if I was president of the United States right now, I would march over there and I would yell at the Democrats. Like, talking, negotiating, being understanding, none of these strategies have worked. Like, it is time to sit in a room and hammer this out and pass these bills this week. That's it. He's the president of the United States. He's the leader of the party. He was elected by many, many million Americans, and American people in all 50 states are banking on him to enact an agenda that they actually support when you look at the components of these two bills. Enough is enough. Whether it's conventional, whether it's typical, whether it's inappropriate, I don't care. He needs to go over there and he needs to play hardball.
Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, thank you so much. Glad, there are many Democrats who wish you were the President of the United States to get this thing up in some level of order rather than this kindergarten class that's run amok. I think we need Arnold Schwarzenegger from Kindergarten Cop when he gets tough and gets the whistle. I think that's probably the much needed, necessary political strategy to get this going. For everybody else, stay tuned for much more on GoLocal. We've got a number of updates and a very interesting Providence story that's developing. We'll have that up on GoLocal Live in probably the next hour or two. Everybody stay tuned, stay safe, and if you haven't gotten vaccinated, it's just ridiculous. 5-year-olds are getting vaccinated now. If you haven't gotten vaccinated, just remember this, 5-year-olds are getting vaccinated. They are lining up to get vaccinated. So no more excuses. This is pretty sad if you haven't gotten vaccinated as an adult. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for much more.